everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself using the chat box at the bottom of the screen. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by using the Q&A box. We'll be dedicating the last 20 minutes to respond to questions you post during the discussion. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A recording of the session, as well as any slides and resources shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week on December 13th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a Crucible of Practice Salon on United Way and CGLR, Aligning for Impact in Education, followed by a session on Following the Money, 190 billion to confront challenges and seize opportunities at 3 p.m. Registration and more information will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is John Gompertz, Executive Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Welcome, and thanks to everyone for joining. As always, thanks to Sierra for her genius producing, and to Becky and Sarah for putting together this session. We've got a great set of guests. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Now, that said, I have some level of situational awareness, and I realize there's a World Cup game going on right now. So some people may have slightly divided attention. And if those people who have some slightly divided attention want to post the score as we get close to the end in the chat box, I think there's some people who would appreciate that. So please do that. Before I bring on Peggy Carr, the commissioner of NCES, National Center for Education Statistics, let me take a minute to relocate us in where we are and what we're trying to do here. For the past 6 weeks, we've had a series of discussions focused on gaining a better understanding of what the NAEP results tell us about the current situation for young people and what steps we all need to take to respond to the obvious learning loss that occurred over the past couple of years. You'll all recall the NAEP results were released in late October. They weren't good. We're going to see this again today. Both reading and math scores went down significantly. The NAEP scores also weren't so surprising. After all the disruption, what did we expect? In a way, I think the NAEP scores were particularly powerful because they told us, or they confirmed, what we already knew in our bones, that all the disruptions associated with the pandemic, from school closures to economic upheaval, to racial reckoning, to widespread illness and death, all that had a big impact on learning, obviously. The job now is to understand as best we can where we are, where those impacts were most profound, and then to figure out how to accelerate equitable learning recovery and point to an even better result than just recovery. We know that is what all of you are doing in communities around the country, and that's exactly what the campaign has been trying to shed light on this fall. Our goals, first, to understand the numbers, get underneath the headlines, to get a grasp on what our challenges are. Second, to chart a path forward that will accelerate equitable learning recovery. For that, we're talking to experts, and we're also trying to learn from communities and school systems that did better than most during the pandemic. What were some of the conditions for their relative success, and what can we learn from them? Today, we're going to go further with our data exploration to NAEP and beyond. We will not only hear from Peggy Carr about the NAEP scores, we'll hear from folks who have additional data that sheds light on some of the prevailing conditions that influence kids' opportunity to learn. We know we're all on this journey together, so we also want to know what you want to know. So please put your questions in the question and answer box. We have Peggy for about 20 or 25 minutes at the beginning. So we're going to have some questions for Peggy before she has to go, and then we will move to our panelists. So if you have questions specifically for Peggy, don't wait till the end. Now, let me quickly introduce our guests for today, and then we'll start our conversation with Peggy. As always, I'm just going to give you a little thumbnail introduction. You can find the full bios at the link in the chat. As noted, we're lucky to have Peggy Carr, the commissioner of NCES. We're just so glad that she's able to join us today. She has been a very busy person, let's just say. We're delighted. Following Peggy, we will talk with Rachel Hanson, who is the project director for the School Pulse Panel at NCES. It's another project of NCES beyond NAEP, and we'll learn about this important new data resource. Then Christy Carmen from the Rapid Survey at the Stanford Center for Early Childhood is going to tell us about that work. That is fascinating. It's a fascinating and important project. And we're glad to have Christy to describe the project and show us some of their most recent findings. Finally, my old friend Bib Hubbard is joining us from Learning Heroes, the organization that focuses especially on parent engagement. Bib is going to be telling us about important recent insights into how parents are thinking, which is perhaps a tad different than we've all seen in the overheated press stories about this over the last few months. So let's start by bringing Peggy in. And as she joins us, let me just say how lucky the campaign is that Peggy is with us today, and how lucky we are that Peggy is the commissioner of NCES, because she is an ace researcher and statistician, and she cares deeply about this work. And I don't think there is anybody in the country who knows this stuff as well as Peggy does. So Peggy, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Well, John, thank you for having me, and what a nice introduction. As long as you didn't tell about my decades of service, that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, that sounds great. So Peggy, let's just start with your overall impressions of the NAEP scores. I assume you weren't surprised, but I also assume you learned some things from those scores. Tell us about that.
Well, in late October, we got some devastating news, perhaps even sobering for some of us who knew that we were going to have a downturn in our scores. But wow, the pervasive nature of these results and the systemic decline that we've seen across groups of subjects, across the states, the jurisdictions, the districts, was quite pervasive. Math particularly was concerning for us because we've never seen a decline in our math scores. You know, NAEP has been around for a while. It is the nation's gold standard. It is that yardstick that we use across the country and the states, because it's the same exact assessment administered for 4th and 8th grade. And we've been doing this for quite a while, since the early 90s for this particular assessment. And so it's a common yardstick for determining what is going on in this country. And the items, of course, are rigorous. They are indications of what students know and can do in these key areas of reading and math, 4th and 8th grade. And boy, are we learning a lot.
Well,
math,
we have this slide up. Let's take us through a little bit of what you're seeing here and what you think it means.
Well, you know, this trend line that we're seeing here starts back in the early 90s, as I indicated. We have an asterisk here that indicates whether that data point in that particular year is significantly different from what we picked up in this COVID um, spotlight in 22.
Mm-hmm.
You can see for math, a significant decline of 5 points for 4th grade. You can see in math for 8th grade, 8 points. And 8 points is a pretty good drop for a NAEP score. And we have not seen any declines like this ever before in these math data. So we were sort of stunned by that. I should also point out for math, where you see the sharpest declines in comparison to reading, where we see 3-point declines, they're statistically significant. But for math, what we're seeing is underneath that hood, we see that students of all abilities from the 10th through the 90th percentile have declined. And we were particularly concerned about those students at the lower end, John, because they were declining even before COVID. And what we're seeing with these results that we shared in October is that they're declining at a faster rate than the other students. And so the COVID really exacerbated what was already a concern for the United States.
Yeah, so when we had your colleague, Mark Schneider, on a few weeks ago, Mark really talked about that a lot. And the term I think he used was the bottom dropping out, that those students who were struggling before COVID just got really whacked. You're seeing the same thing.
Yeah, actually, I think I want to point out another trend that may help you understand how concerning this is.
Please.
Prior to COVID in math, what we were seeing is at the top was, by that I mean the 90th and the 75th percentile, were either showing increases or holding steady. So there was this bifurcation of the abilities, students at the top holding on or doing better, and students at the bottom declining. But what we're seeing now in these data today is that the top is also declining, not quite as steeply as the bottom, but declining nonetheless. We see a similar pattern for reading, again, not as pervasive as we saw for math, but the pattern is still there. Those struggling students were really hit hard by this pandemic.
Some people have talked about the possibility that the decline in the math scores is even steeper because math is harder to do outside of a school setting. Or maybe that's the best way to say that. Is that what you're thinking also?
Yeah, well, it's no secret. The literature is pretty strong in this regard that math is very sensitive to schooling. So it is very correlated with what goes on in the school building, in the brick and mortar building. Less so with math. You'll see this
less so with reading.
So with reading. You'll see that there's the reading score is pretty stable over time because it's hard to move. And it's less likely to be influenced by what's going on. Influenced, yes, but less likely to be influenced by what's going on inside of the school building than is the case for mathematics. It's not unusual for us to read a story to our children at night, to have alphabets and letters and on the refrigerator, for kids to love to read. And so a lot of what happens with reading happens outside of the school building. Not so true with math.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So we also we talked about the Harvard-Stanford study that zeroed in on differences related to income and pointed to poverty as one of the big drivers or one of the big indicator, the things that distinguish various folks. Talk about what you see around poverty.
Well, it's important when we're looking at data that is this complex to sort of understand how all of these variables influence the outcomes that we're looking at and how they interact and influence it. And that's what our colleagues at Harvard was able to do. Now, we were not able to do that with first-time out with these data, but I can tell you we're planning on doing some more advanced analysis. But, you know, the confound between race and race, ethnicity, and income needs to really be understood when people are looking at these data. For example, we see an increase in the gap between white students and their Black and brown counterparts in these data, particularly for the math data. But when you go in and you look at that by income, which is only one measure, one indicator of SES, you see that a lot of that variance is accounted for by the income variable and those factors that are correlated, highly correlated with it. We have to be cognizant that these are not simple outcomes. They are not mediated by simple factors. It's a combination of factors. A lot of them are intercorrelated, and income is certainly intercorrelated with a lot of other factors.
Yeah, and what's your ability with the data to look at, let's say, kids of color crossed with income, so that, you know, we sort out kids of color who are low income, kids of color who are of medium income, and kids of color who are of higher income. Can you sort like that?
Yeah, we can sort by that. But
Okay.
you know what? Even that two-factor matrix that you just described, race, ethnicity by income, isn't enough to truly understand and explain all of the findings, the variance, the outcomes that we're seeing, because there's so many other factors. Let's start with one. Who's teaching these students, right?
Sure.
The how qualified the teachers are, whether they have a background in mathematics, were they trained as a mathematical specialist in this area, how long they've been teaching, all sorts of issues around resources with regard to the districts where they're teaching. There's so many factors that are correlated. So even with those two really, really important factors crossed, we're not gonna uncover all of the factors associated with these outcomes.
You know, I just think I want to pause on that point for a second, because I'll critique what I said. Like, that was all on one side of the equation, which is, who are the young people, who are the students? But you're saying, oh yeah, but there's a whole other side of the equation, like, who are the adults? What's the system they're operating in? What are the resources that are available to them, and so forth? And when we do the demographic thing about who does how well, we can under index for this whole pillar about the adults and the systems. And I think that's really, really important. And then we know, of course, that there's some interaction between where there are resources and where there are well-trained adults and all of that with these other demographic factors. So I appreciate you complicating the equation that way, because that's exactly right. Look, people are talking about, I mean, it's even sort of in our tagline of accelerating equitable learning recovery, but I know that's not what you're thinking about. You're not thinking about, oh, can we just get back to where we were? Because that wasn't actually good enough. So how would you characterize where we were before the pandemic and where you want to go?
Well, you know, a lot of us will just say, many in our community, John, will say, you know, let's get kids back on track. You know, we need recovery. Well, recovery, if we go back to where we were, wasn't so good for many of us. As I indicated before, you know, our struggling students were struggling long before the pandemic hit. And we were really, really concerned about them. And we have to look at all of those factors that were exacerbating this increase in the gap prior to COVID to really understand. And our friends over at Harvard, you know, they have done really, really good work with identifying what factors have the strongest effects. But even then, we have to be very cautious about applying these scientific studies now, based upon what we know and all of the other factors that have been, really, really impacted. Mental health, for example, the whole child. We've seen increases in bullying.
Yep.
We've seen increases in behavioral problems that students are exhibiting in the classroom. I think my colleague will say a little bit more about that with the Pulse survey, but we're picking that up with the NAEP data as well. We have information around technology, and Lord has, I can tell you, we have done a yeoman's job in getting technology out to students as a result of COVID. But you know what? The inequities are still there, and that's what these data show us. Even in that context, we still have a lot to do.
So, Peggy, tell us what we can expect going forward. What's reasonable? Like, we're not going to fix this in a minute. If only we could, right? But we're not going to fix this in a minute. So where should we be focusing our attention? How fast are we going to start to see improvement? And given that we need a long-term commitment to make the kind of progress that we want, how do we talk about these results in a way that doesn't make people want to lie down on the couch and watch the World Cup and think about something else, but actually gets people to take this at the same time, to take it really seriously, but to feel like this is actionable. We can do stuff to fix this. How do we do all those things, and what's reasonable for us to expect going forward?
Well, all of those are really good questions, John. Let me first say that everybody has a role. And one of the first things I think we need to do is to get parents and family and community on board and understanding this isn't going to just go away. This is a serious problem we have here that will impact students' outcomes, their lives for years to come. We have to get a handle on this, and it's going to take all of us doing it. You know, one of the things that I want to say is that there are some bright spots in this data.
Yeah,
they're small.
Good.
Yeah, they're small, but they're there. And there was a couple of jurisdictions, for example, that were able to beat, all odds. LA, for example, had a 9-point increase. We went in, John, and we tried to turn that number every which way is up to see if we can unpack it and determine, that maybe there's an error here, or maybe it's confounded with something else. There's nothing in the data to suggest it's other than what it is, growth for LA. The Dodge schools, Department of Defense schools, that's another sort of bright spot in these data. They've always done well. So I guess I wasn't so surprised that they were one of the few jurisdictions that was able to hold their own. And we also see some bright spots on the reading side. Reading didn't move that much over the years, and we saw a decline, but there were those findings that surprised me. We didn't see gaps in the race ethnicity groups in reading, 8th grade reading, like one would expect for these data. And the cities seem to have held their own. They didn't improve significantly but they didn't decline either. So there are some bright spots here. And I think one of the things we need to do moving forward is to unpack those bright spots. What was going on in these jurisdictions, in these cities? What was going on with reading that we were not able to achieve with mathematics? We've got to learn from what these data say, and not just these data. There are a lot of other data out there, formative data that our colleagues in other areas of assessment we're picking up that have a lot of information that we can use.
I love that because I think it's what you're saying there is so important. If we just constantly say it's urgent and it's a disaster, but don't have the other hand of we can actually do something about this, people really, they get defeatist and fatalistic, and understandably so. So I think it's always important
Right.
to match that sense of urgency with a sense of efficacy. Like, oh, this is not an unbendable problem. And I really appreciate what you were saying there. I'm really sensitive to your time situation, Peggy. I want to check with Sarah whether we have any questions for Peggy before we let you go on and to the rest of your day.
We do have several questions for you, Peggy. We could keep you all day and make you tell ABC News to wait. No, but respectful of your time. One question that came in from James Hare is asking about, given what we know about the significant learning losses that you've just described and that we've seen in the data, even extreme solutions, even if it's something like one-on-one tutoring scaled broadly, might not be enough to meet the moment and meet the challenge. What effect sizes are needed for us to save this generation of students? And do you see, based upon your research, any solutions on the horizon or insights about that?
Well, certainly we've all, as a community, been talking about high-dose tutoring. And I do want to support high-dose tutoring as one of those strategies that really has evidence behind it. We know that it works. If implemented with fidelity and implemented by those who know what they're doing, that will be the catch. Can we do that? Can it be done in such a way that it has comparable impact, effect sizes, regardless of where you are in this country, regardless of how well it's implemented? I think it cannot. It is going to have differential efficacy, if you will. That's what worries me a little bit, because I'm not sure we have the resources and the stamina to implement something so labor intensive as high dose tutoring and get where we need to be. It's going to have to be a combination of strategies. More time on task after school during their summer is going to be a cocktail, but all with the same thing: more time on task. Students really do have to both learn what they did not learn, and then we have to figure out how to keep them moving forward so that they're not behind. This is going to be a massive undertaking.
Wow. Great
Yeah.
answer. Thanks.
If-
Sarah,
If we have time
again?
for one other question,
Please.
I could cluster a few. So
Okay.
that question was kind of looking forward. There's a few questions that are looking backwards in terms of what we can learn, what we can understand about the 2022 scores in terms of what they're telling us about what occurred during the pandemic. Wondering if there's anything that we can learn or any insights you can share about schools that did better than expected in terms of, or clusters of schools that did better than expected based upon the NAEP scores. And one, if there's any insights about the impact of virtual learning, because some schools, like, we thought that was a big contributor, but we've seen some disparities in terms of children who stayed in virtual who continue to succeed. And then you'd mentioned kind of further analysis coming in the future, if you have any details that you could share on that so that we can kind of know when we might be able to dig deeper into this data. So I really did.
So that remote learning
Thanks,
question.
Sarah.
Yeah, that remote learning question is one. If I have just a second or two, I just want to address that one.
Sure.
Because I think this is something that's on everybody's mind.
You bet.
People want to draw a straight line from remote learning to these outcomes that we see. And there is a relationship. We should not deny that math learning is tied to schooling. And this is sort of, I think exemplified by the stronger declines in math that we see here. So remote learning does have some impact, but not the straight line impact that I think people want it to give to it. What do I mean by that? There's so many other correlates. And there are different ways of thinking about one size does not fit all. What was actually happening in the schools, that was not normal either. And then there were different types of remote learning going on with different resources associated with it. So when you say remote learning, you're talking about a multifaceted concept.
Yeah, that's so right. It's like, well, not all classroom teaching is the same. So not all remote learning is the same. Some is great quality and some is not. And I think what's interesting is you're suggesting that remote learning may be particularly valuable as supplemental, but maybe not as primary. We don't know that yet.
Exactly.
But those are the kind of questions we want to explore. To Sarah's last question, what should we have heads up on? What's to come?
Well, we're going to do more. How would I best describe it to our audience? Hierarchical analysis with these data. So we're going to get in there and try to get closer to a cause and effect. These were basically descriptive data. We didn't have time to do the in-depth analysis that can be done for us to really sort of unpack those resilient findings that we know that are here, that we can provide more actionable information to our policymakers. So we're going to do that. Also, we're going to be working with health statistics. You know, some of what we believe may be happening here in terms of these results is that the virus was on fire, at different times and different
places, different times. Sure,
I mean, all of those are correlates that we cannot ignore. So we're going to go in. I heard someone say, perhaps in a question, can you control for some of these factors? We're going to go in and see if we can do that and look at these data again once we pull some of those factors out of the equation. So stay tuned, John. We're excited about more to come.
Right. That's great. Peggy Carr, you are awesome, and you can come back to this show anytime you want. You heard all those questions. People are super interested in this, and we just are enormously appreciative, and we'll all be watching for ABC News to see you talking about teacher vacancies as well. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, John.
You bet. You bet. Wow, that was fantastic. And thank you, Sarah, for your help on that. Rachel Hanson, you want to come on screen and join us now? And let's take down this slide. Oh, yeah, there's that slide. Let's take down this slide and just have Rachel up for a second. And then Rachel will, are you here? Are you here?
I am. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, there. Now I see you. Fantastic.
All right.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you got to take us to school on the School Pulse panel, please.
I can do that. Yes.
What is it? When did it start? What's the purpose here? Tell us.
Sure.
And I know you have some slides that'll help illuminate some of this. So we got to see you big on screen for a second, but now we're going back to the slides.
Okay.
Thanks. Here we are.
Okay. So you want to go to the next one? Yeah, so as we all know, there are a lot of well-founded concerns about educating our children in the COVID-19 environment. And without real-time data, it was hard to capture how dire the situation was in our nation's public schools. It was clear some form of data collection at the federal level was necessary to help answer questions that could inform immediate resource needs. And there were two key government actions that led to the development of the School Pulse panel to help understand challenges schools were facing in delivering education and to do so in real time. These were Executive Order 14,000 from January 2021, which directed IES and in it NCES to collect information to inform agency leaders on the state of the education system as it dealt with the pandemic, and then also the American Rescue Plan Act, which funded the study. And with the EO issued, IES and NCS jumped into action as quickly as we could and utilized as many existing resources as possible to be able to help get a new data collection off the ground with really not much of any lead time. So luckily we were able to learn from the experience of the Household Pulse Survey, and we were able to team up with the group over there to help get operations into motion.
The household pulse study is a regular monthly undertaking by the Census Bureau. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So you're applying sort of their approach to schools. Are we understanding that right?
Yes, there's more complexity with the data collection from schools. I think they were doing a larger sample of households and just kind of putting a blast out of and seeing who answered. We were a little more I don't know about methodical, but you know, we had a sample that we went to that's national representative. We had to go through all of the hoops that we have to typically go through in order to be able to collect data from schools by trying to get, you know, approval through their districts to be able to contact their schools. So we kind of had to go through our normal process that we normally do for our larger studies. And we didn't just kind of like blast 100,000, you know, public schools and try to see whatever responses we could get. So if you want to go to the next slide. So just to provide a little bit of background, so the executive order was issued in January. We actually didn't receive the money to get the study going until May. And then we were trying to shoot for starting our data collection in September. So that kind of gives you the timeline that we were talking about in terms of getting it up and running. And originally, the study design was to develop one large survey instrument that could take up to 4 to 5 hours to complete. It would be fielded each month in order to track trends over time. So really it was, let's throw everything into this large instrument and then be able to track what schools were doing every month. And to help offset the burden of that, we wanted to offer up to $5,000 to schools for their continued participation in the study over the course of the school year. And we had an initial nationally representative sample of 2,400 public schools. And our goal was to have 1,000 schools repeatedly participate in order to be able to have enough power on our estimates to report out by certain key estimates or key school characteristics. Mm-hmm. But I saw your face, John. A 4-hour survey is not something that anybody wants to participate in.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard plenty about how pressed schools are. So I bet filling, I don't like a 4-minute survey. So a 4-hour survey, I'm out.
Yeah. Well, it didn't go great. But luckily it was the same time, at the same time, Peggy was coming in as our appointed commissioner, and we sat down with her and brainstormed to figure out ways to redesign it and get it back on track and hopefully get some data from some schools that we could report out on and were useful for decision making. So what you see here on this slide is we ended up taking a short break for October through December to promote the survey more. We enlisted in education leadership to help send letters to districts to encourage them to approve us to be able to participate. We improved our contact collection, so we knew exactly the point of contact for the school to send the survey to. And then we chopped up the 4-hour-long survey into 30-minute surveys that were content-specific rotating modules. So the pitch then became, here's this 30-minute survey. It's going to be on different topics. And we also described the reimbursement as $400 a month that could come in the form of a debit card. So that sounded more appealing. We started back up in January, and for reference, in September, we had 170 schools participate. In January, we were up to 670.
Oh, wow.
And as of the last few months, we've been hovering around 1,000.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so the redesign was successful for us, and we've been able to hit our goal for reporting out estimates. If you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, let's keep going.
So how do we come up with content? For that 4-hour-long survey that I mentioned, we initially put a call out to ed leadership, White House leadership, and CDC contacts and asked for their feedback. Mm-hmm. Because of logistics and timing, we had to limit the instrument to be a school level survey. So therefore, anything that was requested that could be best reported at district level, we had to kind of nix that and only focus on school information. So everything about School Pulse Panel as of right now is reported at the school level by the school principal or someone that they deem knowledgeable enough to report and respond. And after redesigning the shorter instrument, we used that initial content we received. And then moving forward, we've been putting out a call for content that we do in 3-month cycles. So as of late, we've been seeking content from NCES, IES, Department of Ed program offices, OMB, White House Domestic Policy Council, the CDC, and USDA for the most part, when we've been sending our content calls requests out. So here on this slide, you can see the different content areas that were collected for January through June in the 2021-22 school year. The items in the blue box show the content that was repeated each month. Specifically, we wanted to track types of learning modes being offered to students, and also how many students and staff were having to quarantine due to positive cases or exposures. And then the items, I'm sorry. Yep.
Learning modes are? Rachel?
In person, hybrid, and remote.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Yep.
Keep going. Keep going.
And then the items in the yellow boxes show the content that was rotated in and out.
Okay, great.
So that was what we did for January through June. And then the next slide, which is my last slide, is what we have collected in August, September, October, November, and what we're about to start for our December collection, which begins on Thursday.
Great. So let's go back and say, like, what are you trying to accomplish and contribute with this information?
Yeah, so I think the initial goal really, it started with how are students receiving their education, you know, at the beginning and the middle of the pandemic. That was the pressing need. And are there any inequities in how some subpopulations are receiving their education? Is everybody having an equal opportunity to have in-person versus virtual or hybrid? And it kind of expanded from there. When we received our content calls, there was a lot of interest in you know, the learning recovery, and mental health was obviously a big one. And so we were able to create this vehicle of collecting the snapshot of what schools are experiencing based on, you know, for different content areas, and report back to our stakeholders and say, this is the status of what's happening in this month. And it allowed them to use that information for data-driven decision-making. And so that's what we were trying to accomplish this. On the other hand, it also served another purpose, because NCES hasn't had a quick turnaround study like this before. So this was kind of the guinea pig for that, to see, you know, what all was really required to be able to get something like this off the ground. How quickly could we turn data around, and what are the approval processes that we have to go through? So it was really kind of twofold. And is this something that we could do long-term? How successful could it be? We think it's successful. We would like to continue it if we're able to get funding for it. So it also served that goal as well.
So let me ask you, I get the audience you're talking about, which is policymakers in different places in Washington, but then how broadly available are you making this information? Is the data accessible to people who are watching this webinar right now?
Well, so we haven't been releasing any micro data files. So anybody who wants to actually do like school level analysis themselves, we don't have that available yet. And that's mainly because we just haven't had time to be able to do that. We have been releasing the findings on an IES dashboard. And so we have key findings that are in an interactive dashboard on that website. And then within that as well, we have downloadable Excel spreadsheets that have estimates and standard errors. And that's for all of the items that we collect on our instruments. So all of that information is already available to the public. And we try to get that out within 5 or 6 weeks at the from the end of data collection.
And so, and the pulse is a monthly pulse. So
Correct.
you say, if I'm tracking, there will be new data available every 5 or 6, every month,
Yes.
with a lag of 5 or 6 weeks from when you get is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And I think Sarah dropped in the chat where people can access this data, which is fantastic. But for those of us who might not do that, give us a couple of headlines. Like, what are you finding? What's interesting here? What's important?
Well, I think I had focused I would say, I think let me see, I have some notes here. I first focused on looking at high and low poverty findings, but I think we might get to that in a little bit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think what the data really shed light on what schools have been dealing with, at least obviously for the past 3 years, and the effects that the pandemic has had on the educators and students. And from the NAEP data, we see the drops in the assessment scores. And the SPP data would really provide more context into the factors that are contributing to that.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing more students and staff seeking mental health services. We're seeing more reported behavioral incidents in the classrooms. We're seeing more student and teacher absences, teaching and staff vacancies, which was released this morning from our October collection. There's real difficulties finding substitutes. And there's major concerns about teacher and staff burnout. So that's all of the types of information that we've been able to glean from the various collections that we've had over the course of the calendar year.
Great. Okay. That's really helpful. Thanks so much, Rachel. I hope you'll hang with us because I want to talk to Christy and then Bib, and then we'll all have a conversation together. So thanks very much. Christy, can you join us? And just to remind folks, Christy is with the Stanford Center on Early Childhood, and they run a survey called RAPID. So what we're doing here is we have the NAEP data, but then we have these other sources of information that are even more current, and we're trying to get a picture of what's going on, how to think about what's going on, and what that tells us about the best responses to accelerate equitable learning recovery. So, Christy, thanks so much for joining. I appreciate that. And really interested in learning more about RAPID. So tell us about RAPID. Same questions. What is it? When did it start? What are you trying to do here?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be a part of this discussion today. If we could flip to the next slide, that's where I've got some project overview information. So the RAPID national surveys started in April 2020, just as the pandemic was shutting down communities across the world. And it was born out of the realization, understanding that as communities were shutting down and families were going into lockdown, that there wasn't going to be any knowledge base about what families with young children would be experiencing, because this was unprecedented times. And that the understanding the pandemic-related disruptions to young children and their families' lives and to their development was going to be essential to kind of mitigating the impacts of those disruptions on development and on families' experiences. So the goal of RAPID is to fill that gap. So to understand in real time, in an ongoing way, what families with young children are experiencing. So the first survey launched, like I said, in April 6, 2020. And at that point, it was a weekly survey. And it was designed to be a rapid cycle of putting surveys out into the field nationally, listening to parents, pulling that data back in, and really quickly analyzing it, interpreting it, and disseminating data so that there could be an ongoing source of information about what families were experiencing.
So just if I understand, we got the school pulse panel, which is about what's going on in institutions. We have RAPID, what's going on here for human beings that are not
Exactly.
institutions, and with a focus on younger kids, early childhood, which you describe how, what's your
Birth
category?
to age through age 5. So children
Okay.
under 6.
Okay,
Exactly
great.
right. Yep. So we have our sample is national, and it's made up of households with at least one child under the age of 6. And because of the pandemic and our origins with the start of the pandemic, and because it's just hard to reach people in person, it's an all online survey, and it continues to be all online. So families can engage with us through an online survey they can complete on their smartphone, and most families do, or any device that has a Wi-Fi connection. And we offer the survey in English and Spanish. And about a year after starting the Rapid Household Survey, we launched a parallel national child care provider survey. And this was because so much of that first year in 2020, and I think most of us on this call will recall that like 2020 was extremely illuminating around the interconnectedness of families and their experiences, and the other adults who are with our children during the day. You know, how important schools function as a form of childcare and for working parents and for parents who need childcare, and also childcare providers. We are still seeing the impacts of the pandemic in terms of the workforce and the ability to provide a sustainable source of affordable and accessible childcare. So families with young children. So we've been learning a lot through both of these surveys about what our Rapid team likes to refer to as like kind of a surround sound, that full context of the important adults in young children's lives. How are they faring? And how we can use that information and that real-time data to make data-informed decisions about how to support them. So next slide. Next slide, please.
Sierra, there we go.
And you can click through, this is an animation, but we can click through it. So I want to tell you a little bit about how Rapid is a little different from other surveys. And I think especially I'm sensitive to the fact that during the pandemic, especially, there was a lot of surveying to try to understand families at the local level and in states and others, as Rachel and others have just mentioned. But we have this specific focus on early childhood, that early developmental period that we're still learning so much about what happens and what the implications of that development are for later in life. This rapid cycle data collection. So we've been collecting data weekly, and then in July 2020, we moved to every other week, and we're now on a cycle of monthly data collection. And that allows us to be really responsive to the frequency at which circumstances are changing for families. You know, if you recall in 2020, it seemed like there were new policies and new data and new information about how COVID was impacting us just almost daily, it felt like. But that slowed over time, and so too has our strategy for understanding families' experiences. So we're now on a rapid cycle. Every month we have a survey in the field. We're interpreting that data and analyzing that data and posting it to our website with a policymaker and early childhood advocacy community in mind, but also the general public. We want to make this data available to everyone. And we've been doing that at least a couple times a month, the data updates on our website since then. And our survey instrument includes data that allows us to use quantitative methods to understand families' experiences, but also a lot of open-ended questions that give parents and providers an opportunity to just share more with us, just to give more detail, add some texture, and to share. And what we've seen is an overwhelming response to those open-ended questions. We have about 200,000 responses to those open-ended questions to date, which tells us that parents and providers are really eager to share more. They're eager for that opportunity to be heard. And those are really powerful data that we like to pair with the quantitative data to really elevate what we're hearing in parents and providers' own voices alongside the data findings.
Well, how many people receive the survey?
Yes, so in our household survey, we have a large pool of about 15,000 households that we sample from to get a representative response in terms of income level, race and ethnicity, and where they are distributed geographically. So that pool is about 15,000 families, and it's growing all the time. And then for the provider survey, we have a pool of about 2,800 childcare providers across the country. Yeah, it's a great question. And
so that are you getting input from 15,000 families, or you're not getting responses from that many people?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
What's
your response rate like? Yeah, I see. Okay.
It's a pool
I
we
see.
can draw from that we sample from. And so our aim is for the same, just to echo some of Rachel's methods points earlier in her presentation, to have sufficient power to do the kinds of evaluations and make the kinds of claims that we'd ideally like to from the data. We aim for 1,000 responses from every monthly survey.
Okay.
And
Great.
so we are able to
Understood.
select more than 1,000 to account for non-response. And but given that we're moving quickly and we want this to be an adaptive tool, something that we can change over time, but we've landed on what feels like a really excellent blend of rigorous practices and methods, but a practical approach to being able to move quickly. And we have a similar design as the school pulse survey, which is great to see that we have this core set of items, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, with also the ability to add in modules that are timely if there are some interesting kind of policy relevant issues emerging, or something sort of specific and timely has happened nationally. We can ask about that, and we have that ability to rotate modules in and out over time. Rapid is really defined by our multi-sector partnerships. We're really committed to making this data available and useful to people kind of across industries and sectors who are thinking not just about early childhood policy, but policy. Policy impacts our communities and our families and schools, and we really care deeply about this data being useful to all of those folks who are thinking about our health and our well-being and our educational experiences across the board. And a key feature of Rapid is that we are sensitive to the nature of academic research, how it can sometimes be kind of extractive, and data gets taken into these surveys and parents maybe never know how it's used or applied in the future. But we have developed a really robust feedback loop with participants in Rapid, where we share back our data findings with them. They receive a monthly newsletter of updates. They have opportunities to share their feedback with us every month. They can tell us if we've missed something, if there's something they'd like to share, but that we didn't ask about, if a question felt off or too sensitive, they have that opportunity to share that. And then we also have an opportunity to share with them policy wins when something new happens that is a result of parent-led information and parent-led data. We can share back with them, that win and that moment to help build that sense of, we hope, individual sort of self-efficacy and participation in this process. We really care a lot about, uplifting parents' experiences in all of this learning. So next slide.
Fantastic.
So we are organized and advised by a really lovely group of people, experts in early childhood philanthropy research practice. There might be some familiar faces here, but they have been essential ingredient to our design and our interpretation of the data and the framings of the findings. Next slide. There was a slide here that I'll just speak to that goes over our five core Rapid areas of focus. And that is, we have a strong focus on material hardship. So experiences of economic, their household economic circumstances. So their ability to meet their basic needs. And that's defined as housing, utilities, food, healthcare, and childcare. And we also focus on adult well-being and child well-being, as well as healthcare. So access to preventive visits for children. That means those well baby and those well child checkups and vaccines. And for adults, that means that they're not delaying healthcare or experiencing barriers to accessing healthcare. And then any use of non-parental care. So we are always asking about what parents' childcare arrangements are and if they're meeting their needs and preferences. So those are our five core areas that are in those in our survey every month that we add modules to over time.
Christy, I have two closing questions before I turn to Bib, which is, how do you hope people who are on this call, people who are leading community coalitions and just the kind of advocates who you were talking about earlier, how do you hope people will use this information? And then how do people access the information and stay up to date on new findings?
Yeah, exactly. So our hope is that this data is timely and relevant, and it's reflective of what parents of young children and what providers are experiencing in real time, and so that it can be used in real time to inform the best approaches to meeting families' needs and supporting children in their development at this early stage. But we know that this is foundational for later learning and development in life.
Sure.
So we really hope that We can be a resource. The data is available on our website, as I mentioned, and we also are always fielding data requests. So we do make data sets available to anyone who would like to request. So you can reach out to me and we can organize that. And another thing that I want to mention is that we are in the process, Rapid is like rooted, our origins are rooted in the pandemic and the response to that need to understand what families are experiencing in the moment. But it's really evolved. It's proven to be a useful tool for collecting real-time voices and real-time information about what families with young children are experiencing. And we've had a lot of interest from local communities and states, stakeholders and leaders in those places around being able to validate the national findings at that local level, saying this is really powerful and it's awesome to see this, but in order to really move the needle in my local context, I need to be able to see this data locally. So we've started launching a new branch of Rapid, our Rapid program, which is place-based surveys. So the last month we started a California statewide survey.
Wow.
We have 4 partners on board for community-based surveys in Kent County, Michigan, Dallas, Texas, Harris County, Texas, and San Francisco. And we have plans to launch new community place-based partnerships for to do exactly this, for exactly this purpose, to inform local decision-making, provide those real-time voices of parents, and really uplift their experiences as part of that decision-making process to meet their needs and support children. So that's another way that we can be supportive of the field and make this real-time data available.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Christy. That was great. Stick around. We'll be back to you in just a second. And then let's just have Bib join from Learning Heroes. Bib, I'm sorry it took so long to get to you. People, we have to do the full disclosure here. Bib and I have known each other for 25 years, which shows on me, but it doesn't show on her. We met working on the President's Summit for America's Future in 1997, which is pretty amazing. Not your first rodeo with the campaign either. So welcome back, Bib. And for those of you who haven't encountered Learning Heroes before, can you just give us a little background on Learning Heroes and your focus and on your survey work?
Absolutely. So it's great to be here, John, and to see you again, and a privilege to be with the campaign team again, and to be here with all of you in this really important conversation. I know I've already learned a ton about these 2 surveys.
Me too.
But for those of you who might not be familiar with Learning Heroes, we have a fairly simple mission. It's to support parents as their child's most effective education advocate. And when I founded Learning Heroes 8 years ago now, I kind of, I brought with me my experience, which is, as John mentioned, from the public sector at the White House and at the Labor Department, in the corporate sector at Scholastic for many years. And then immediately prior, I was at the Gates Foundation, so in philanthropy. And the through line for me was just the fact that as it relates to education policy, families have consistently been overlooked by our policymakers when it comes to making changes into how our children are taught and how our schools are run. And in particular, our Black and our Brown parents, our low-income parents, have been underserved, I would say mightily, in that process. And so we focus on Black and Brown parents in particular. And to do that well, we need to start with listening. So we do deep listening among families, educators, principals, teachers, guidance counselors. We've conducted hundreds of focus groups, qualitative sessions, workshops, but then also we've conducted annual national surveys. So, and we focus on K-12. So you've heard the Rapid survey was on, parents with young children. The Pulse survey is schools itself. We focus on families predominantly with children in K-12, but also K-12 educators. So that's where we spend our time. And then we provide tools, content, resources for the field in order to meet families' needs and based on the insights we learn. So with that, I'm just going to dive straight into the insights, if that's okay.
Go,
and
good,
pull
perfect.
Up my slides. So less on methodology, but I'm happy to talk about that and more kind of on what we're learning as we dive in.
Great.
So this is from our national survey from May of 2022. However, we have found since 2016, when we conducted our first national survey, that 9 out of 10 parents believe that their child's at or above grade level in both reading and math. And that is regardless of race, income, or education level, geography. Sort of universally, parents have this perception. And you heard Peggy at the beginning, and you've seen the NAEP data, you know, when you look at the 26% of our 8th graders who are proficient or above, that's a fairly stark disconnect. So when you can ask ourselves, why is that the case? If you go to the next slide, you will see that when we ask parents, teachers, and principals, you know, what are the most important ways to know how a student is achieving? Well, for parents, the number one way is report card grades. Of the top 4 most important measures, report card grades, tippy top. Principals, you can see only 36% of principals place report card grades as one of the top 4 ways to know how a student is achieving. Even less teachers, 30% of teachers say the same. And when you ask teachers to rank the different measures that are most important in understanding student achievement, report card grades are number 6. So number 1 for parents, number 6 for teachers. So you can start to see the why behind this. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that 84% of parents report that their children get all B's or above. And this is also consistent since 2016. So this is not just a symptom of the pandemic grade inflation. This has been happening for quite some time. And I think, as Peggy was noting, you know, pre-pandemic, our achievement results were not where we would want them to be, especially for our Black and our Hispanic children. But when you think about parents who, you know, their kids are getting all B's or above, to a parent, you know, good grades equal grade level. And teachers and educators know that that's, you know, report card grades encompass less about achievement and more about other important factors. Are they tutoring their homework in on time? Are they being good peers? Are they asking good questions? But to a parent of a 4th grader who's getting an A in reading, they assume that means that child is reading at a 4th grade level, which is not the case. And then that leads us to my final slide of this batch. You know, the why this really matters is, you know, parents have very high college aspirations for their children. So I know there's lots of debate about different options and pathways for children, which is really important. But again, in May of 2022, 77% of parents, you know, report that a 2 or 4 year degree is, you know, absolutely essential, very important for their child. And you can see again for Black and Hispanic families, it's even, you know, higher percentages. So parents have these high hopes for their kids. They believe they're on track, and yet, you know, very likely with this NAEP data, most students are probably suffering some sort of setback from the pandemic. So we see this as an urgent call to action to make sure that parents do have a complete holistic understanding of how their child is both achieving and developing, so that they can, you know, take advantage of all of these interventions that are happening. Again, Peggy mentioned high quality tutoring, high dosage tutoring. We see, you know, in our data from last summer, and even from this fall, EdChoice had an October survey where 57% of parents said that they were not going to sign their child up for tutoring. And I believe it's because they think why would I, right? Like, my kids bring home B's, they're doing great. So we're going to keep on keeping on. And yet all of those resources, those interventions are not being fully utilized and further setting our kids back. And then my final, you know, kind of comment, former Secretary Duncan reached out to me when he saw our data, and we were talking about the impact of NAEP. And he said it so well. He said, you know, Bib, we have these 2 crises in America. We have this achievement crisis that we're seeing, these massive gaps. We also have an awareness crisis around parents' view of their children's achievement. And until we address this awareness gap, this parent awareness gap, we will never be able to address fully that student achievement gap. And I just felt like that's so spot on. We are stuck in the status quo until we can help parents have a more holistic, complete understanding of how their child's, again, developing and achieving.
Let me push you on it for a second. On we have that slide 7 where you've got various findings about what parents are worried about. They're not there. We see the slide about high ambition, and then we see this sense that their kids are doing okay. So here's what parents are worried about. Talk about this a little bit. And the thing that struck me when I looked at this is how their kids are doing academically rates somewhere in the middle of people's concerns, well below other things. Talk about that a little.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not super surprising that, you know, parents are prioritizing their child's happiness and emotional well-being. We've all been through the ringer, and that's fairly consistent, you know, anyway. Parents just want their kids to be happy, of course. And the fact that there's increased stress and anxiety, I think even, again, Peggy was mentioning the violence at school, the bullying, those are real concerns. So not super surprising those rose to the top. And again, if you consider that parents, their kids are bringing home A's and B's, they're thinking, hey, they're doing okay. So that's why I believe that, you know, that gaining the knowledge and skills to be ready for college, being on track, don't rank as high because they have this perception that their kids are doing fine. The thing that's of most concern to me is, and I think a little bit of this at least cut off on mine, but the two lowest worries are reading and math skills. And when you look, and these are top 2 box numbers, so this is like, you know, very extremely worried percentages. But when you look at the very, you know, worried, it's only 19% of parents who say that they're very worried or extremely worried about their child's math and reading skills. And again, you just go back to that NAEP data, and you know, like, we need parents to be worried about that too. I mean, sadly,
Right.
Not to diminish the mental health and the emotional piece, because that's critically important. And you actually, I think, you know, as parents, we know our kids can't really fully learn unless they have that emotional well-being. That's critical, but parents do need to focus on the fundamentals, the reading, the math skills as well. And again, I think it defaults to this report card that is really the only measure parents are given to make that assessment.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I'm going to ask that people put questions in the Q&A box, and Sarah's going to help me figure out which questions we advance here. But Bib, while we're doing that, just talk a little bit about how you hope that people on this call will use the data, and what you would like to see people do around parent engagement.
Absolutely. You know, we all have a role to play here. And so for parents, we would just ask your teacher, what grade level is my child on? Like, just super simple, like, where is my child right now? And then work with your teacher to co-create a plan to address wherever your child may be it they need to be more challenged, or they have some, you know, scaffolding or some making up that they need to do. But just ask that very simple question. And then I would say to school leaders, principals, support your teachers in having those conversations with parents, because it is not easy. And when we ask teachers why they aren't having those conversations with parents, it's the top 2 reasons is fear-based. I fear I'm not going to be believed, and I fear I'm going to be blamed. So teachers, and they say, you know, quantitatively, they need more support to be able to have these kinds of conversations with parents. So school leaders give teachers the time, the training, the tools, the expectations to be able to engage with families in this way, where they can co-create those plans. And then finally, I would say for district leaders, make sure that you are promoting these resources. I can't tell you the number of parents we talk to, either through our data or just through workshops and other ways that we engage with families. They don't know that these resources exist, right? They don't know that tutoring is available. They're unaware of a lot of the different kinds of interventions that are available to them. So make sure you're promoting what they can do. And then also, I mean, this is my new sort of like, we're moving into the district serving space, and the procurement policies should just be completely blown up. I mean, they are impossible to navigate and are an absolute barrier to innovation in every every which way you can imagine. So if we want to do things differently, we need districts to be able to be innovative and to take some risks and to engage new actors. And procurement really prevents them from doing that. So that's another soapbox for another day, but
Great.
that would be one other thing I would say.
Excellent, thanks. And I think that my initial reaction, Bib, is actually all of us are bad at feedback in almost every element of our lives. And so it's a particularly hard thing. You know, we don't like feedback from our spouses, particularly. We don't like feedback from our bosses. It's also true, we don't really like to give feedback. Like, we're just, this is a whole category that is extremely difficult. And then you get this situation here, which is just so fraught to start with. That was really, really helpful. Let's take down the slide. Let's invite everybody back on screen. And Christy, I'm guessing you listened to what Bib was just saying, and I wonder how people get a sense of how their kids are doing when they're younger. What's that look like? And is the system any better? Do you have a sense from all of your survey work with families about whether people whose kids are 0 to 5 have a clearer picture of what's going on with their kids?
One of the things that really stuck out to me about the last slide that was just up, and thank you so much, Bib, was the rate of concern around meeting basic needs. So on your slide, Bib, that was, if I wrote this down correctly, 50% of white households, 72% of Hispanic households, and 44% of, I'm sorry, I have that Black, 50% of Black, 72% of Hispanic, and 44% of white. We're concerned about meeting basic needs, and that is really echoed in our ongoing data from the rapid survey as well, that we've been collecting information every month since early 2020 about experiences of material hardship. And since that time, families have been telling us that they've been, more than 20% of families have been telling us they've been experiencing hardship. And we've found over time, and this is actually won't be a surprise to anyone because of the rising costs of everyday items, that number has really jumped up this year. It peaked in July 2020 at 44% of households nationally telling us they're experiencing difficulty paying for at least one basic needs. So I raised this just to build on what we found in our survey is that there's these associations between those experiences of material hardship and parental emotional distress. And then when parents are also telling us when they're experiencing emotional distress, they're also reporting emotional distress among their children. So I point this out just to talk about that fuller context in which young children are developing when parents are concerned about making ends meet, meeting their very basic needs, that can interfere with their ability to provide that responsive caregiving that we know that young children need in those very early years, and that has impacts for later development as well. And another thing that has been really rung true in the rapid data in over the last 2.5 years is that parents are experiencing a lot of unpredictability, and part of this is schooling and childcare disruptions, but impacts employment and ability to make basic needs as part of that. And that when parents are experiencing unpredictability in their ability to make basic needs, meet their basic needs, that has an even greater effect on their emotional distress levels, meaning that unpredictability, there's a direct relationship between those experiences and increased emotional distress. So for Rapid and our focus on adult well-being in that broader context in which young children are developing, we think that smart policies and programs to address the needs that families are experiencing, the very basic needs, can help provide a more positive environment for the whole family, for the whole context to the children and the caregivers that can be supportive of learning later in life.
Bib, you have a thought? You look like you had a thought on that, a response to that.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just, there's so many rich questions in the Q&A, so I was about to dig in. So
go ahead,
Christy,
go ahead. Dig into, I see that there are a couple of questions about parent engagement. And then I want to come back to you, Rachel. You're hearing a lot about the sort of the human side of this. And I know that people like those fancy people at OMB and others tell you what you ought to be looking at, but I hope we're getting you to, we're sending energy your direction to ask those in institutions how they're experiencing the human beings on the other side of the equation, because I think that would be really interesting and valuable data. I'm sorry, go ahead, Beth.
No, I was just, there's one question about high dosage tutoring not being, something that parents are interested in, and, what else are they interested in? So I was just saying, we did ask one question about, different kinds of actions parents were planning on taking this school year. So our survey was May of 2022. So it was sort of predicting what parents would do this year. And so one of the things they pointed to was demanding mental health supports from schools, and in a much bigger way. So we asked that same question in 2020, and it was about, just over a third of parents said that they would, be demanding mental health supports. And it's now almost 50% of parents who say that. So again, it really tracks with their worries. I think because they're not as worried academically, they're not as focused on those academic supports, but they're really focused on the social, emotional, the mental health, those kinds of supports that schools can offer, since, kids are spending so much time there. So that was just one response I was gonna.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I wonder about what Christy was saying. Like, if you're super stressed out in whatever life you're having, it can feel like, somebody's giving you feedback that I'm worried about your kid's performance. Is like, it could be just one thing too many. I can't deal with that. I'm gonna pretend like that's good for now, because I got too many other more urgent needs. And we know, as I said, it's hard to receive feedback that is not great about your kids.
Well, and I think that, most parents just have access to that one report card grade, which again has a lot of important information, but it's not like the diagnostic. It's not, there are other measures that aren't like just a state test at the end of the year. And the number one way teachers say the best way to know how a child is achieving is ongoing communication from the teacher. So teachers understand the value of it. I just think it's broken in the how. Like, how do we give teachers, again, that time, the training, the support to be able to have those conversations, so that parents they're fixers, like they'll be on it. They want to help their kids. But I think they're just misled by what the report card actually means. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting. Rachel, I'm curious, you're listening to these other reports about data. I'm curious what you're thinking, and whether you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of been the heart of Pulse in a way, pun intended, maybe. And it is to try to get at these other aspects. We're seeing the concrete decrease in academics, but what else is happening in the schools? And so that's what we're really trying to get to with Pulse, and like creating that larger picture and story of what's the students and staff are experiencing. And so we're finding that. The information that we got from our mental health services module was really informative, that it's a problem between both schools or students and staff, and the burnout that they're experiencing is a really big problem. And you're going to see that in the classroom, and you're going to see that in how students are behaving and performing. So we've been taking that kind of view in terms of what questions should we ask, in terms of, we're getting content topic ideas, but then we, as the Pulse panel team, think about, okay, well, what would be really informative, not only in terms of resources that are helpful, but to inform the public of what teachers are experiencing, on a daily basis, and what the principals are observing that their staff is dealing with, and what their students are experiencing in behavioral incidents and stuff like that. So we're trying to get at that as much as we can. And obviously that means that we have a lot of perception questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it at least adds more information to the story, right?
Yeah, you bet. Sarah, there was just a good question I think that went by in the chat. Can you share that question with us? And at the same time, Sierra, you want to put up the poll? That doesn't mean we're done. We got 5 minutes to go, but let's put up the poll so people can answer that. And really appreciate everybody engaging with the poll. We look at these results every week, and we're constantly trying to figure out how to make these sessions as interesting and as valuable to folks on the calls as possible. So please fill that out. And as we do that, Sarah, did you have a question that you can advance from the chat?
Sure. We just got a question from Anna Magana, asking if any of you have recent or past research on family childcare homes, or if not, any recommendations. And so Christy, that's probably a good question for you, as that's more in your wheelhouse, I think.
Yes, I actually was just typing in the chat, so thanks for sparing me that. Thank you. Great question, Anna. I'm going to post here in the chat a link to a fact sheet that we put out. It's not as recent as some of our other topics, but in our childcare workforce survey, we do field those among family childcare providers. And all of our analyses, when we can, includes the perspectives of family home childcare providers. So that fact sheet I just linked to links to other resources from within that PDF that describe the experiences of home-based childcare providers, and along some of the same lines that I mentioned earlier, their experiences of hardship and meeting basic needs, their emotional well-being, and their ability to provide that caring, responsive care to the children. Great question.
Thanks. I think I want to close with one question that this sort of flows from something I said earlier, which is, it's easy to get on these sessions and detail everything that's terrible. And that is not motivating to people. I'm just going to tell you, it's not motivating. It's exhausting and defeating. So I'm going to go around and ask each one of you something that you've seen in your data that makes you enthusiastic, optimistic, forward-looking. Bib, I'll start with you. So we'll go in reverse order.
Great. Yeah. So what I'm really optimistic about is when we ask, what's most important for engaging families or getting out of pandemic learning loss, teachers, parents, and principals all agree it's teaming up and working together in a trusted way that is sort of the way forward. So overwhelming majorities, like to the tune of 8 out of 10 teachers,
Fantastic.
Principals, and parents. So for me, that's the way forward.
Fantastic. Up. Great. Christy, something from your research that makes you feel optimistic.
One of the things that we've asked in an ongoing way is about sources of social support. And so parents and caregivers reported that both prior to the pandemic, their sources of social support were their colleagues and their friends, and then for some, their local religious and faith-based community. And during the pandemic, that switched. We saw that more parents, in fact, the majority of parents were telling us that their young children were the major sources of support. And I think there's there's one potential lens that you could look at but that's too bad because it meant that there was a cutoff of other sources or something. But I love, as a mom of 3, I love thinking about families coming closer together and spending that time together and drawing that strength and experiencing those bright spots together.
I love that. That's fantastic. And Rachel, bring us home. What do you see that's making you feel optimistic about what can happen going forward?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing through our study is, schools are trying really hard. They're trying really hard. They're doing what they can to really address any pandemic learning issues. We're seeing more and more that are incorporating high dosage tutoring, and they themselves are saying they find it effective. They're utilizing mental health and trauma supports, and also teacher professional developments that focus on learning recovery. And they're using different approaches like diagnostic and formative assessments. We're seeing them continue to use those things to really see where they are. So they're really taking a broad a broad approach to trying to get kids back to where they need to be academically. And that's optimistic for me, I guess.
That's pretty good. That's pretty
Yeah.
good. Love that. You all were a terrific panel. Totally appreciate you joining us and sharing your information with all of us. Huge appreciation to all of you from the campaign. Also want to re-thank Peggy for joining us at the beginning. That was terrific. Sierra, you want to put up the screen? Oh, here you go. Here's the screen. Here are the upcoming attractions. We hope that you will join us for both of these sessions next Tuesday, which are terrific. And for now, I think that's it. Again, thank you to our producer, Sierra, to Sarah Torian for helping us through this session, for Becky putting it all together, and to all of our guests for joining us, and for the fantastic work that they do on behalf of kids in schools. So with that, I bid you all a good afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.